Hello everyone. Now I'm going to present to you part 2 of 4 lectures on psychosocial development in middle childhood. And this time I'm going to talk with you about families and children. So as we've discussed in this class, families are an important context within which development occurs. And as we've spoken before, our development is influenced by the interaction between our genetic background and our environments. In developmental research, we talk about shared environments and non-shared environments. Shared environments have to do with what siblings or people who are raised by the same parents in the same home might have in common. Non-shared environment has to do with what is different for them, things like friends or schools. And in the middle childhood years, non-shared environmental influences are increasing, while the influences of shared environments are decreasing. In the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about 2 things, family structure and family function. When I refer to structure, I'm talking about who comprises the family. How is it set up? Who lives in that same home? Structures could include nuclear families, extended families, step families, adoptive families, gay and lesbian families. When I talk about family functioning, I'm talking about the way that a family works to meet the needs of all of its members. Families have many important functions, as we'll talk about. Families help children by providing for their basic physical needs. They keep them safe, they keep them fed, they make sure they have doctor appointments, etc. They encourage their learning, and they help them find a good educational program, and if they have special needs, they advocate that they have modifications that they need. They help their children develop a sense of themselves and a sense of self-respect. They nurture friendships, and they foster harmony, stability, and overall well-being. It's important to keep in mind that no family always functions perfectly. And in fact, we don't really have an alternative to the family structure that works better for children. So children do better in families than in any other kind of institution. Children in the middle childhood years value continuity and predictability. So even if parents have divorced, having an ongoing, consistent, and predictable relationship with both parents is a really important part of healthy psychosocial development. Sometimes there are other challenges to stability other than divorce, such as if a child's growing up in a military family who must move often. And paying attention to helping the child deal with those transitions and particular challenges is going to be important in the middle childhood years. As we know, genes and environment interact, and children who are raised in the same household by the same parents do not have the same experience as each other. In fact, changes that occur in a family are likely to affect each family member differently. Could be influenced by their age, their gender, their temperament, all kinds of contextual factors. Most parents, when honest, will tell you that they respond differently to each of their children. There's kind of a temperamental interplay that occurs with parents and kids. And some children need their parents to behave in specific ways. Some need more limits, some need fewer limits. And a really sensitive and responsive parent is likely to have a different style with each child. And while children in the middle childhood years want to make sure that everything is fair and equal, they may begin to notice more and more that siblings are treated differently based on a lot of individual factors. And it's important for families to talk about these things and to try to be intentional about keeping things so-called fair, but also honest that these sorts of things do individually vary over time. So as I mentioned, there's many different ways to have a family. You've got 2-parent families, and there's a lot of examples up here for you to consider. And we've got single-parent families, also many different ways that those can be put together. There are also families where there are more than two parents involved in child rearing, such as having extended family, or when a child's growing up in a plural marriage situation or a polygamous family. So these could be thought of as either two-parent or single-parent, depending on the best way that you have to think about a family structure. Disruption in a family can happen in lots of ways. A parent may die, a family may move frequently, or a family may go through a separation and a divorce. In fact, approximately half of families in the United States have been impacted by divorce. The United States leads the world in the rates of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And while we have some research that suggests that single parents, step parents, and alternative families can do very well by their children, most of the research suggests that children tend to do best living with married parents, parents who are committed to each other and get along well with relatively little conflict. That's the key. You want to make sure you minimize conflict around the child. Divorce should be thought of not as an event, but as a process. And there are definitely times where if there's high conflict between the parents, divorce is the best thing for a child's development. There are studies that suggest that it is worse to grow up with lots of conflict and have your parents stay together than it is to have an amicable divorce, have much less conflict, and then go out of your way to see both parents on a consistent basis. So the harm that may come from divorce for children doesn't have as much to do with the actual split of the family. If that's handled well, that can be fine. And by handled well, I mean consistent contact schedules, respect for both parents being expressed by both parents, nobody saying bad things about the other parent in front of the child, and very little conflict in front of the child. If divorce is handled well, it is less likely to have an adverse effect on the child. What hurts the child is a lot of high conflict. So when we're considering the impact of divorce, you also want to think about all the things that can go on in the context of a divorce. So there can be economic stresses that a divorced family has a harder time managing than they did when they were together. When families go through divorce, they may actually bring new adults into the home. That can be a good thing, or it can be a challenge. Sometimes extended family members become more involved. That can be a good thing, that can be a challenge. And it can be really challenging but important for both parents to come to some kind of consensus, even though they've divorced, on the big picture points of parenting. What kind of disciplinary procedures should be used? What sort of expectations should we have for the child? And most importantly, there should be a culture laid out of open communication where there is absolutely no secret that is kept between child and adults. It's really important that children are never told, don't tell your mom about this or don't tell your dad about this. Secrets are harmful, and secrets are a real problem when it comes to vulnerability for abuse or neglect. So in a family going through a divorce, it's important that both parents speak respectfully about each other in front of the child, and that nobody joins with the child and tries to have a sort of secret alliance against the other parent. That's where the harm can come. So in general, the research tells us that having two adults who get along well as parents in the home is probably the healthiest way to go. They generally function best, with their children reporting better educational, social, cognitive, and even behavioral outcomes. Interestingly, these two-parent families operate just as well if the parents are of the same sex as if they are of other sex, a different sex. Positive effects of growing up in the midst of a healthy adult relationship really does go beyond childhood. Children raised by parents who truly value each other and treat each other well in front of the child are reported to have healthier relationships as adults themselves. So as we think about family structure and function, it's important to keep in mind that families can come in all different structures. And while the research suggests that overall two parents in a committed relationship is likely to create the most stable home for a child, there are also advantages and challenges to alternative structures. So in adoptive and same-sex parents, for example, they are thought to function typically pretty well, and research suggests sometimes even better than your average nuclear family. And this is thought to be due to intentionally committing to being parents and having to consider that decision and going out of your way to make it so. Step families could experience a wide variety of outcomes. Some function extremely well, and positive relationships tend to be more easily formed with younger children, particularly those under 2. It can be a bit harder with teenagers. Other times, step families can really face a lot of challenges, especially when the two parents have different ideas about what matters in child rearing. Step parent may find that he or she has to be differential to the biological parent because the parenting rules and norms of the household that the child has grown up with, it's important to keep those consistent. So the step parent really needs to follow the lead of the biological parent in most situations. Above all, you want to try to make sure, as with any family, that we're keeping conflict low and that children don't ever feel like they have to declare a loyalty to one parent or another, biological or otherwise. We are currently seeing an increase in the number of families where grandparents are the primary caregivers of their child's biological child. So grandparents are raising grandchildren. Now, in general, there are a couple of challenges to look out for. With grandparents as lead caregivers, we tend to see lower income in retired persons. There could be more health problems, and there could be less stability as far as where they live and how often they move. Interestingly, current research also suggests that the circumstances that lead to a child being raised by a grandparent often are pretty complicated, and it could involve something happening to the child's parent, maybe an illness, perhaps death, or perhaps substance abuse or crime, or some reason why the parent had to give up custody or wasn't capable of raising a child. The loss of a parent, no matter how one gets there, is a very difficult thing for a child to manage, especially in preschool and middle childhood. So it could be that the grandchildren being raised by grandparents are also pretty complicated and are actually at increased risk of having special needs and needing to have modifications in their school environment, either because of the emotional traumas that they've experienced or because of a host of contextual factors that contributed to their initial parenting relationship breaking down. And so while these grandparents who may have fewer resources than they did when they were younger are challenged to raise a child that they love dearly but may be pretty complex, our recent data suggest that these grandparents actually receive fewer services for the children with special needs than circumstances where the child's being raised by their parents. We don't yet know if this is because grandparents are less likely to ask for help or don't identify the special needs, but there's a lot of work going on right now to try to support grandparents as they tackle this challenge in their later years. Being a single parent is also a challenge. On average, this family structure functions a bit less well for children than a two-parent family. But that doesn't mean that if you find yourself in the circumstance of being a single parent, that you should feel badly about that or automatically assume that it's not good for your child, because there are an awful lot of factors that can impact how well that goes. So for example, single parents are often stressed because of economic factors, and that might lead to problems with stability, where they're moving from place to place. Whenever possible, trying to maintain a consistent neighborhood and school program for a child of this age is really important. Having consistent friendships with peers is really important. For a single parent, if they're going through economic stress, they're also probably experiencing a lot of stress by trying to both manage work and manage family. It could be that they get some supports from the broader community, or perhaps from family, or perhaps from friends. Wherever those supports can come from, having additional adults who are there to either support the parent or provide more time and attention to the child, it's likely to be a good thing. So single parents can do just fine, particularly if they have some outside resources that can help them. So overall, regardless of structure, you're likely to have some challenges in every family. The two most impactful challenges on child development are growing up in a home that is impoverished, where you have low income and a lot of economic stress, or growing up in a home with high conflict between the parents. Those are the two primary risk factors for difficult outcomes later in development. So family income, unfortunately, as we've discussed, does correlate with the structure and the function. So grandparents and single parents being most at risk for economic stress. Any risk factor that's there can be countered with protective factors and buffers in the community. So it's not like structure and low economics is a destiny for a bad outcome, but you just have to be really thoughtful about providing the kinds of supports that you can to a family who's going through multiple stresses. And probably the most important malleable or changeable stress that we can impact is how much conflict the child experiences growing up. Conflict between adults or between parents and an older child does harm children, particularly in their psychosocial development. Fights are thought to be more common, according to the research, in step families, divorced families, and extended families, but fights can happen in any kind of family. And it's really important for parents to keep their disagreements away from the children. Fights between parents should happen well outside the earshot of a child. And so while there are all kinds of research about genetic effects and the impact of poverty, it's probably the impact of conflict on child development that has the most deleterious effect. So that concludes our introductory lecture on families. There are other courses in human development and family studies that will go into family structure and function in much more detail. So thank you for your time and attention.